10,000 years ago, before calendars, clocks, or farming had reached Britain, someone tried to predict the future. Which they had no writing, no numbers, no calendar. They dug 12 pits into the ground. That sounds almost absurd, until you see where they put them. In what is now Aberdeenshire, Scotland, hunter-gatherers arranged the pits in a long, deliberate arc. Thousands of years later, archaeologists excavated the site and noticed something strange. The shapes and arrangement of the pits appeared to echo the changing phases of the moon. Dark, waxing, full, waning. And then the pattern pointed to something even more important. From the site, the landscape, when just finding food, the landscape marks the direction of the midwinter, a sunrise, the point that could have provided an annual reset for a lunar count that would otherwise drift out of step with the seasons. If that interpretation is right, these people weren't simply digging holes. They may have been building a way to know where they were in the year. And, more importantly, what was coming next. But that isn't the strangest part. The strangest part is that they left no written instructions telling us how they figured it out. No surviving explanation, no diagram, no name for the person who first noticed the pattern. Just 12 pits in the ground and a sky that kept repeating itself, because today, predicting what comes next feels almost effortless. Your phone tells you when the sun will rise. A weather app tells you when the rain is coming. A calendar tells you exactly where you are in the year. But for most of human history, none of those things existed. Mistime the movement of a herd, and you could miss your food supply. Misjudge the coming season, and you could prepare too early or too late. For people living directly off the land, a mistake measured in days or weeks could become a problem measured in hunger. So long before anyone could ask, "What day is it?" someone had to solve a much harder question. What happens next? That's the real story behind Warren Field. Not simply the invention of a calendar, but the invention, or perhaps the gradual discovery, of something more fundamental, the ability to turn yesterday's observations into tomorrow's expectations. These spanned, if these pits really were used as a time-reckoning device, during an ice age, whence food, they may preserve one of the earliest physical traces of that leap, from simply experiencing the world to preparing for what it was about to do. To understand what those 12 pits may have been doing, you have to look at their shape. Their arrangement has been interpreted as tracking the roughly 29.5-day lunar cycle, a rhythm that, left uncorrected, slowly drifts out of sync with the actual seasons. The alignment toward the midwinter sunrise may have solved exactly that problem, giving the count a fixed point to reset against each year. To manage that, someone had to watch the night sky for years, maybe generations, and hold the pattern in memory long enough to translate it into earth and stone. There was no paper, no numerals. Just eyes, memory, and an almost unreasonable amount of patience. Archaeologist Vincent Gaffney, who led the original analysis, described it as one of the oldest known time-reckoning monuments in the world, built by hunter-gatherers roughly 10,000 years ago, long before farming had even reached Britain. Not everyone agrees. Some archaeologists have challenged whether these astronomical relationships were intentional at all, rather than coincidental. Pits silt up, they get redug. Reading a single deliberate calendar out of the ground centuries later is a genuinely difficult call, and that argument matters. Because it means you're not reading a diary. You're reading a shadow of one, but here's where it gets stranger. Warren Field wasn't the first hint. Decades earlier, researcher Alexander Marshak examined a 20,000-year-old bone fragment from France, and under magnification found something odd. A sequence of small, irregular notches, grouped in a way that seemed to track the changing phases of the moon. That reading is still debated. Plenty of scholars suspect he saw a pattern that isn't quite there. What's harder to dismiss is that similar marked bones and antlers keep surfacing across Ice Age Europe, spanning tens of thousands of years. Something was compelling people, long before Scotland, to carry the sky around with them, scratched into bone. And Warren Field wasn't an isolated idea, either. Thousands of miles away, people were doing something remarkably similar. In Australia, indigenous communities watched for the rising of the Pleiades star cluster to signal seasonal change. In the Andes, communities watched the same stars for clues about the coming rains, information that could affect when crops were planted and harvested. Different continents, different tools, the same problem. Something in the sky could tell you what the Earth was about to do. That repetition is itself evidence. It suggests we're not looking at one lucky accident, but at something close to an inevitable human response to an unforgiving problem. And the problem really was unforgiving. Living entirely off what the land gave you meant there was no last winter to look up, only what lived in your own memory and whatever your elders had bothered to pass on. Miscalculate a hunt or a harvest by even 2 weeks, and people starved. Noticing the moon's rhythm, The sun's Liatsgur, the sun's lowest arc, the return of certain stars, was the difference between a community that ate through winter and one that didn't. Seen that way, the notched bone and the aligned pits aren't primitive superstition. They're some of the earliest evidence we have of a recognizably scientific way of thinking. Observe, record, predict. Test against what actually happens. Revise. It's tempting to picture one lone genius staring at the sky, struck by a single flash of insight. That flatters the story more than it explains it. What we're really looking at is generations of quiet, unglamorous labor. A child taught which notch follows which. A pit dug slightly wrong, then corrected. An argument, almost certainly, about whether the moon really matched what the elders insisted it would do. The people who did this left no names behind. What they left is a structure in the ground that still points with unsettling precision at a sunrise that hasn't shifted in 10,000 years. For a long time, popular imagination filled that silence with myth. Sun priests, secret cults, a lost advanced civilization gifting knowledge to people who supposedly couldn't have managed it alone. It's a more dramatic story than the truth, which is exactly why it stuck. The evidence doesn't support it. What it supports is quieter and, in its way, more remarkable. Ordinary hunter-gatherers, using nothing but sustained attention and inherited memory, working out one of the deepest patterns in nature. We've always underestimated what unassisted human observation, kept up long enough, can actually achieve, because here's the twist. This was never really a calendar. A calendar tells you what day it is. What Warrenfield and the notched bones may have actually given people was something more valuable, the ability to know what was coming before it arrived. And prediction opens up possibilities reaction never can. You can move camp before scarcity forces you to, not after. You can plan a gathering to bring scattered bands together at exactly the moment food allows it, instead of hoping they show up. Some researchers argue that shared seasonal calendars may even have helped early human groups coordinate. They gave separate communities a reason and a moment to meet, trade, and intermarry. Prediction didn't build civilization on its own, but it may have been one of the first ingredients that made greater cooperation possible, and cooperation, sustained across generations, is part of what eventually allowed for settled farming, stored surplus, the first villages, the first laws about who owned what and when. The pits at Warrenfield may not be a monument in any sense we'd recognize. They may be closer to the root system beneath civilization itself. Picture that quiet Scottish field once more, not as it is now, but as it was. A handful of people, generations deep, in the unbroken habit of watching the sky, cutting one more pit into cold ground because the moon told them it was time. They never knew their names would vanish while their pits survived them. They weren't leaving us a message. They were trying to make sure children who didn't exist yet wouldn't go hungry. The first calendar may not have been humanity's first attempt to measure time. It may have been our first attempt to stop reacting to the future and start preparing for it. 10,000 years later, under the same moon, we're still doing exactly that.